Welcome to NatRevMD, a podcast where we share tips on optimizing medical billing and improving practice efficiency so you can have the business of your dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Signorelli, founder of NatRevMD. Let's get started. All right, so are you still offering telehealth in your practice? Or have you quietly stopped because the rules kept changing over the last 12 months? Or maybe you were charging patients up front and now you're trying to figure out, should you continue to do that? Today, we're going to do a quick update on telehealth and all the things that have been going on the last 6 to 12 months and an update and a glimpse into what we can expect for the next year. So if you have stopped billing telehealth, you weren't alone. We had practices that were doing that. We had practices that were having patients, pay cash up front and then reimbursing them that. So today we're going to kind of chalk through some tips around telehealth as we enter into 2026. So as you guys know, I'm Dr. Heather Signorelli. I'm the co-founder of NatRevMD. We are a full-service medical billing company. We help practices within multiple different subspecialties. We love OBGYN, urgent care, allergy as some of our favorite types of practices, though we have many others. So if you are looking for a new revenue cycle management team, head on over to natrevmd.com and check us out. Upper right-hand corner is where you can find information about whether or not you may qualify for a free metric audit. All right, so we've helped practices 5 million and plus who've actually increased revenue by over 6 figures by fixing simple billing workflows that others were either afraid to bring up, didn't know how to operationalize, and really excited to have been able to help the teams we have over the last several years. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about the latest on the CMS telehealth information, which was just updated recently. And I'm going to show you how to keep billing for telehealth while protecting yourself from all the craziness that can occur. All right, so let's talk about what's actually happening here. Congress keeps extending telehealth flexibilities. They did it in 2024, again in 2025, and now the latest document confirms extensions through the end of 2027 for most services. But here's what we are seeing in the field, right? A lot of practices have either stopped offering telehealth entirely or they've started charging upfront deposits because they were terrified of patient responsibility, which we get, which actually we were telling our own practices to do. So they were obviously worried that insurance wouldn't pay and the patient would get a surprise bill. And then they were stuck, chasing collections or dealing with upset patients. Totally get it. Again, we had recommended the same thing. The uncertainty of all of this is certainly real, but we do want to make sure that you guys are not completely abandoning telehealth because that is a mistake. And you can continue seeing patients virtually and generating revenue. You just need to think through some of the nuances around this. As always, really, really important call out here. Make sure that you guys are paying attention to patient AR. We have a playbook that we put together. It's called the 2026 Margin Protection Playbook. It includes information around managing kind of patient AR. So head on over to natrevmd.com, margin-protection playbook, and link is down below. All right, so let's break down the 3 biggest mistakes that we're seeing with practices right now when it comes to billing telehealth so you can avoid those. Obviously, number one, abandoning telehealth completely because of uncertainty, right? Some practices have just shut down their telehealth programs. They didn't want to deal with it. I get it. They figured if the rules kept changing, they just didn't want to bother with it. Totally understand that. But if you have a practice that has been thriving with telehealth, patients love it, you like the convenience, no-show rates had dropped because you had that flexibility, then definitely make sure that you reinstate that, right? So I wouldn't abandon it yet. Just got to kind of keep up with all of these changing regulations. So having telehealth in the office, as you guys know, can help support your providers who may be jam-packed. They have a back-to-back patient visits, no-show rate that is an issue if you only offer in-person visits, and is a revenue generating option to have for offices, especially if people don't want to drive in 30 minutes for some sort of a patient visit that can be handled over the phone. We certainly recognize the importance of telehealth for a number of different reasons, so certainly don't want folks abandoning it. Now, mistake number 2 is not setting expectations about coverage and responsibility. Now, other practices are still doing telehealth, but they're not having that coverage conversation up front. And I think that is going to be really important, really just to set the stage. Everybody's assuming or could be assuming that insurance will pay like it did during the pandemic, but we don't always know that. And so the claim could get denied or processed with a higher patient responsibility, and now you've got a collections problem. So do think it's important to make sure that patients are calling their insurance, they're checking telehealth coverage beforehand. Maybe you want to still do a small deposit, maybe it doesn't need to be as big as before, or if you have a patient who you're concerned isn't going to pay, doing a credit card on file is another option, right? So if a patient schedules a telehealth visit with your office, your front desk is really going to want to make sure that they mention something about insurance coverage, that the patient has instructions about calling the insurance, what to ask to make sure that they have coverage. And obviously making sure that they recognize that these may be denied. And if it is, that they will get a bill for this. Now, the assumption is that patients will come to you, they will bill it, and the insurance will pay. But that may not always happen. And so they could be getting a bill with partial coverage or even a higher copay. And so really want to make sure the patients are aware that there may be an out-of-pocket cost that's higher than they're normally used to, but it is one of the conveniences of telehealth. So just making sure that you have that upfront conversation with your patients. All right, mistake number 3 is actually underutilizing telehealth. And that is for specifically high value non-procedural visits. So obviously, these extensions aren't just about avoiding in-person visits. They're actually about using telehealth strategically to increase efficiency and patient access for services that doesn't require a physical exam. So many practices are leaving this revenue on the table because they're kind of in this, I'd rather see them in person first mindset. And I think we had just started crossing over to really utilizing telehealth appropriately over the last few years. And I think now everybody's a little spooked. So I'm going to give 2 examples. So an example for an OBGYN practice. So say you're bringing back every patient into the office for routine postpartum follow-ups or birth control counseling. Now, meanwhile, if you are able to do some of your postpartum checks, and I know it doesn't always make sense for everybody, but certainly birth control consults, there are different ways that you can have certain visits within your practice, depending on the patient, depending on the subspecialty, have a visit through telehealth. Your patients are satisfied with this. Physicians may be able to have a little bit more wiggle room in their schedule throughout the day. And so this can be a mechanism by which you can put this into place. This also helps no-show rates, right, for these types of appointments because, it may not be a visit that a patient really prioritizes high. And so if they think, I have to drive, go through traffic, sit in the waiting room, drive back, they may not show up. And so if you are able to kind of schedule these in blocks for your patients to use, it could free up afternoon appointments for, say, IUD placements or other in-office procedures or new OB visits. So it's a way to prioritize both your patient's time, your time, and also potentially increasing revenue. Now, another example is actually something that you could do for an urgent care center. And obviously, you're using telehealth as a last resort, but a patient with a simple rash or pink eye has to come in, wait, and take up a room that could be used for a patient needing sutures or an EKG or something more acute. So if you could use telehealth to triage and treat simple cases virtually, it may be an option. Again, up to you clinically in terms of what you need to see, but you could potentially add additional revenue and volume with certain targeted telehealth visits. So just an idea to consider, are there places or types of patients within your subspecialty that you could do telehealth, and how do you market for that and advertise it for that? And again, the whole goal here is to increase flexibility with your physicians, increase flexibility for your patients, decrease no-show rates, and still capture this revenue while we have the option, right? We don't know how long this is going to go, but it is an option. Again, you'd still have to have that conversation with the patient regarding insurance coverage, out-of-pocket payments, and copays. Again, really going to be dependent on the patient's insurance, what they will pay. Again, this is just an option while we have it for patients where it makes sense, who are willing to pay that. Again, personally, I'd be willing to pay 20% more if I did not have to come in and if that wasn't necessary clinically. So it's just another way to increase patient access, maximize value of your physical footprint in your office, and potentially increase revenue, especially for those types of visits that don't need something in person. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the steps around implementing this if you are trying to get this back in the door or haven't really monopolized on this as much as you probably should. So step 1, implement a pre-visit insurance verification script for telehealth. So before you schedule any telehealth visit, your front desk needs to have a conversation with the patient. So they can say something like, we're happy to offer this visit via telehealth. However, because telehealth coverage varies by insurance plan, we recommend you call your insurance company before your appointment to confirm that telehealth is covered and ask what your out-of-pocket cost will be. We'll bill your insurance, but you're responsible for any copay, coinsurance, or deductible. So then they can ask the patient if they want to proceed with scheduling. So just a recommendation around how you can manage that. So obviously this does 2 things, right? So first, it shifts the verification responsibility to the patient, which is appropriate, right? Second, it sets the expectation up front that they may have out-of-pocket costs. No surprises, no collections nightmares. Ideally, if they bring in that amount or you have a set amount that you collect up front, great. Just make sure you have a refund process. All right, step number 2, update your telehealth consent form to include financial responsibility. Really, really want to make sure that all of this is put in there so that they know what their out-of-pocket may be. You can certainly discuss your telehealth consent, all the things, HIPAA, technology, yada, yada, but just need to make sure that you have some financial responsibility language in there. Just something that makes sure that they understand that insurance coverage for telehealth services may be different than in-person services, and that they have to agree to take responsibility for that cost, right? So that's the copays, coinsurance, et cetera. All right. So want to make sure that the patient signs that before every telehealth visit, or at least annually, and that you make it clear that their responsibility is to check with the insurance ahead of time to make sure that they know what their coverage is. All right. And last is just making sure your billing team is aware when you have telehealth visits. So you want to make sure that that process is clear in the type of visit, because oftentimes, depending on how you manage billing, your billing team may not be reading every note, right? So if your billing team isn't coding for you in terms of your clinic visits, they may not be reading a note that says telehealth. So you want to make sure that those appointments are either clearly labeled as telehealth, or that there's a clear process to signify that that was a telehealth visit, so that the correct place of service and information is attached to the claim to make sure that it is billed correctly. So again, want to just make sure that you have a process to do that appropriately, because the last thing you want is to get an audit and you haven't been billing appropriately, and it just will be a big pain. So obviously, if a claim does get denied, you just don't want to write it off. Definitely try and appeal it, see what happens. The rules are definitely changing for a lot of payers over the last few years, but kind of in this wiggle room, we are seeing denials right now that are payer errors, not actually policy violations. So there is some of that kind of confusion going even on the payer side. So just to summarize, don't abandon telehealth completely. I know it's a lot of uncertainty. It is for us as well, a lot of going back and forth. You can keep seeing these patients and generating revenue. Just protect yourself by setting up patient expectations up front, updating your consent forms, and of course, working out a really solid process with your billing team so that you know how you're going to bill for these, how they classify, and then just get an understanding of what these denials look like if denials are coming in related to telehealth, and what those options are in terms of appealing, or if it's payer-specific policies that you need to pay attention to. All right, have a good week.